The story begins with a simple plan. Nathan was excited to finally get a quiet night alone in his newly rented house on the outskirts of a sleepy town. It was an old, sprawling place, a relic from another era with creaky wooden floors and ivy creeping up its stone walls. Despite the chill that seemed to seep into his bones when he first toured the house, Nathan was drawn to its vintage charm and the promise of solitude. Little did he know that this night would haunt him forever. The first few hours were peaceful. Nathan had prepared a warm meal, played some music, and sprawled out on the living room couch, enjoying the rare serenity. He sank into the silence as the evening light gave way to the deep blue of night. Outside, trees rustled in the cool breeze, their shadows playing across the large bay windows. At around 11:30 p.m., he decided to head upstairs to his bedroom. The quiet was so intense he could almost hear his own heartbeat, and the house, like all old homes, seemed to have a voice of its own. The stairs groaned underfoot, and a cold draft slipped through the cracks in the walls, making Nathan shiver. He couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, but he brushed it off as an overactive imagination, one fueled by the house's age and his isolation. Nathan entered his bedroom, a cavernous space with high ceilings and antique furniture that had come with the house. He set his phone on the nightstand and began his nightly ritual, brushing his teeth, washing his face, and avoiding the dark corners where shadows gathered thick and deep. The mirror over the sink reflected the dim glow of a single overhead bulb, and he couldn't help but feel uneasy, as if the reflection was a fraction of a second behind his movements. He shook his head, splashing cold water over his face, and went back to his room. Settling into bed, Nathan scrolled through his phone, the screen casting a stark light on his face. He tried to ignore the house's groans and the occasional creak from the wooden floorboards. Sleep slowly began to take over, and just as his eyes drifted shut, a loud bang came from downstairs. Nathan's eyes shot open, and his heart pounded in his chest. He held his breath, straining to listen, but the house was eerily quiet once again. He told himself it must have been the wind slamming a loose shutter against the side of the house. Still, he grabbed a flashlight from the nightstand and swung his legs out of bed. The house was cold as he ventured into the hallway, the shadows seeming to stretch and sway in the darkness. The flashlight beam wavered as he gripped it tightly, making his way toward the staircase. The silence felt heavy, oppressive. "Hello?" Nathan called out, hating how thin and shaky his voice sounded. There was no reply, just the faint sound of leaves rustling outside. The living room was bathed in moonlight, and everything seemed in order. He checked the front door and found it locked, the windows shut tight. With a sigh of relief, he convinced himself he was overreacting. But as he turned to head back upstairs, the sound of footsteps, deliberate, heavy, and unnervingly slow, echoed from the basement. The hair on Nathan's arms stood on end. He swallowed hard, each breath shallow and quick. "Get a grip," he thought. Maybe it's just the house settling or some animal that got inside. Gathering every ounce of courage, Nathan approached the basement door. He placed a trembling hand on the knob, twisting it slowly. The door creaked open, and a waft of cold, musty air rushed out to greet him. The flashlight beam barely cut through the darkness, revealing a narrow wooden staircase that led down into the inky black void below. He hesitated, knowing that venturing into the basement alone was the last thing he wanted to do. But he couldn't ignore the sounds. He descended step by cautious step, the wooden stairs groaning beneath his weight. At the bottom, he found himself in a wide, dusty space filled with old furniture draped in white sheets, like forgotten ghosts. The air was thick, and the smell of damp earth made his nose crinkle. Nathan swung the flashlight around, trying to find anything out of place, but there was nothing, just stillness. He was about to turn back when he heard it again, the slow, dragging footsteps, but this time they came from behind him. He whipped around, the flashlight shaking in his grip. There was nothing there. His breath came in short, ragged bursts, and his pulse roared in his ears. He stumbled backward, nearly tripping over an old trunk. "Just leave," his mind screamed. "Leave now!" But then, the flashlight caught movement. One of the sheets covering an old chair had begun to slide, as if an unseen hand were pulling it away. Nathan froze, his body paralyzed with dread. The sheet crumpled to the ground, and the chair was empty. But then he saw it. an imprint, as if something invisible were sitting there, pressing down on the old cushion. His instincts kicked in, and he bolted up the stairs, slamming the basement door shut behind him. His hands were shaking so violently he struggled to lock it. Adrenaline coursed through his veins as he backed away, his heart thundering. Nathan grabbed his phone, ready to call someone, anyone. But the screen was dead. He had charged it before bed. How could the battery be empty? Suddenly, the temperature plummeted even further, and a whispering voice, faint but unmistakable, drifted from the darkness. "You shouldn't have come here." Nathan's blood turned to ice. The whisper was soft, like breath over his ear. He spun around, but there was nothing but shadows stretching across the walls. Panic set in. He sprinted upstairs to his room, slamming the door behind him and shoving a heavy chair under the knob. His chest heaved, and he listened, praying he wouldn't hear anything else. The house had fallen silent again, but it was the kind of silence that felt loaded, as though something or someone was waiting. Just as he began to calm down, he felt it, a cold pressure on his shoulder as if an icy hand had just brushed against him. He whirled around, and there it was, a shadow, darker than the night itself, standing in the corner of his room. It had no eyes, no features, just an emptiness that seemed to suck in the light. Nathan's scream caught in his throat. The shadow glided forward, and with each step it took, the room grew colder. Desperate, he grabbed the lamp from the nightstand and hurled it at the figure, but it passed right through, shattering uselessly against the wall. The shadow loomed over him, and he could feel his strength draining, like the very essence of his being was being siphoned away. The last thing he heard was the whisper again, right by his ear, "You'll never leave." The darkness consumed him, and the house fell silent once more. The next morning, the landlord arrived to check on the property, puzzled by Nathan's failure to answer his calls. The front door was still locked from the inside, and nothing seemed amiss. Except for Nathan's phone, lying on the living room floor, its screen cracked and the battery still fully charged. As the landlord stepped inside, he could have sworn he heard the faintest echo of a whisper drifting from somewhere deep within the house. But he brushed it off. After all, old houses always had their secrets. Lucas loved the thrill of exploration, and abandoned places were his playground. When he and his friends heard about the derelict St. Margaret's Hospital, they couldn't resist. The place had been closed down for decades, left to decay on the outskirts of town, and locals whispered about the ghosts of patients who had never left. Lucas was skeptical about the rumors, but still intrigued. On a cold October night, he and two friends, Marcus and Jenna, set out to see if the stories were true. Armed with flashlights, a camera, and a healthy dose of curiosity, they arrived at the imposing building. Its windows were shattered, ivy had consumed much of the brick facade, and the wind whispered through the hollow halls like the remnants of forgotten souls. "Creepy as hell," Marcus muttered, but Lucas just grinned. "Come on, it's just an old building," Lucas said, leading the way. They pushed through the rusted doors, which groaned in protest, and stepped into the dim, echoing foyer. Dust motes swirled in the air, illuminated by their flashlight beams. The walls were lined with peeling paint, and an eerie silence blanketed everything, heavy and suffocating. They wandered through the empty corridors, the once busy hospital now a shell of its former self. Wheelchairs sat abandoned, some tipped over, and rusted gurneys lined the walls. They passed operating rooms with shattered lights hanging overhead, their shadows twisted and strange. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the air felt, as though the building itself were holding its breath. "Guys, listen," Jenna whispered. They paused, and for a moment the only sound was the faint rustling of the wind outside. Then, from somewhere deep within the hospital, they heard it. A dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. Marcus swallowed hard, his bravado vanishing. "Maybe we should go back," he said, but Lucas shook his head. "We haven't even seen anything cool yet," Lucas argued, though his voice betrayed a sliver of doubt. He led them deeper into the hospital, past the decrepit patient rooms. They turned a corner and found themselves in the psychiatric ward. The metal bars on the windows and the padded remnants of isolation rooms sent a chill down their spines. Lucas lifted his camera, snapping a picture of the ward. The flash briefly illuminated the space, revealing something he hadn't noticed. Faint handprints smeared on the inside of a glass observation window, as though someone had been clawing to get out. He stepped closer, studying them. "Did you hear that?" Jenna whispered, her voice tight. The dragging sound was back, louder now, accompanied by the faint echo of footsteps. Marcus backed up, bumping into an old metal file cabinet. "We should go," he insisted, his voice cracking. But it was too late. A loud bang reverberated through the hallway, coming from somewhere nearby, and all three of them jumped. The flashlights flickered. Jenna gasped, shining her light down the hallway, and there, just for a moment, they saw something. A shadow, impossibly tall, disappeared around the corner. But what really unsettled them was the figure's outline. Its limbs seemed too long, and its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Lucas tried to steady his breathing. "It's probably just an animal," he whispered, though he knew how absurd that sounded. His heart raced as they slowly advanced, more out of fear of staying still than courage. The hallway twisted and turned, leading them into a large open ward with decaying beds arranged in neat rows. Marcus kept his flashlight trained on the far end where darkness pooled thickly. "This was a bad idea," he said. Before anyone could respond, the dragging sound grew louder, accompanied by something else. A wet, choking wheeze, like someone struggling to breathe. Lucas spun around, his flashlight beam darting across the room, but he saw nothing. Then Jenna screamed. Lucas and Marcus whipped around to see her pointing at one of the beds. At first, they couldn't tell why she was so terrified, but then they saw it, a shape lying beneath the moldy sheets, the outline of a body. The wheezing continued, and the shape under the sheet shifted. Lucas dropped his camera, the clatter echoing through the room. He took a step back, but as he did, the sheet slowly slid off the bed, revealing a figure. It was a man, or what was left of one. His skin was gray, hanging loosely off his skeletal frame, and his eyes were sunken in black. He opened his mouth, and that horrible wheezing filled the room. "Help me," the figure croaked, his voice a ragged whisper. He reached out with a hand that was little more than bone and sinew. The friends screamed and bolted, sprinting back down the hallway. They didn't care about the noise they made, only about escaping. They reached the foyer, but as they threw themselves toward the doors, they slammed shut on their own, as if an unseen force had trapped them inside. Jenna pounded on the doors, tears streaming down her face. "We have to get out!" she sobbed. The temperature plummeted, and their breath came out in frosty puffs. The wheezing sound was closer now, impossibly close, and then the lights of their flashlights went out completely. They were plunged into darkness, and a deep, malevolent voice whispered through the void. "You cannot leave." Lucas fumbled with his flashlight, slapping it in desperation. When it flickered back on, the beam illuminated Marcus's face, pale and terrified. But then Lucas realized Marcus wasn't looking at him. He was staring at something behind Lucas. With dread pooling in his gut, Lucas slowly turned. Standing inches away from him was the shadowy figure they had seen before. It towered over him, its limbs twitching and bending at unnatural angles. Its head lolled to the side, and empty eye sockets bore into Lucas's soul. The figure lunged. Lucas screamed as darkness enveloped him, an icy grip seizing his heart. The last thing he heard was Marcus and Jenna's screams echoing through the hospital. When the police found the camera days later, it was sitting neatly in the center of the foyer. The footage showed Lucas, Marcus, and Jenna walking through the hospital, laughing nervously. Then came the sound of dragging footsteps. The video ended abruptly, cutting to static, but not before capturing a shadowy figure lurking just out of the flashlight's reach, watching them. No one could explain how the friends had vanished without a trace, but one thing was certain. St. Margaret's Hospital had claimed more victims, and the whispers of restless spirits grew louder in the small town. Some nights, people swore they could still hear Lucas, Marcus, and Jenna's screams echoing from within the crumbling walls, pleading for a rescue that would never come. Sarah's grandmother's house had always made her uneasy, even as a child. It stood at the edge of an old forest, shrouded in mist more often than not, with gnarled trees pressing close to the property. The house was ancient, built from heavy, dark wood that creaked under the lightest footstep. Whenever Sarah visited, she'd hear stories about the place's history, tales of whispers in the woods and ghosts that walked the halls. She'd always dismissed them as the musings of her superstitious grandmother. But when her grandmother passed away, Sarah found herself the reluctant heir to the house. With no other family left and her own life in disarray, she decided to move in temporarily. She thought it would be an adventure, or perhaps even a chance for a fresh start. Little did she know that the house had been waiting for her. The first night was quiet, almost too quiet. Sarah lay in the bed that had once belonged to her grandmother, wrapped in thick, heavy blankets that still carried the faint scent of lavender. The wind outside howled, and the branches of the ancient oaks scraped against the windows. She turned over trying to get comfortable, and just as she was drifting off, she heard it. A soft knock at the bedroom door. Her eyes flew open. She lay still, barely daring to breathe. The knock came again, more insistent. She glanced at her phone. 3:12 a.m. Who would be knocking at this hour? Gathering her courage, she called out, "Hello." There was no answer, only silence so deep it felt as though the house itself were holding its breath. Sarah tried to calm her racing heart. It must have been the old house settling, she told herself. She closed her eyes, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was just outside the door, waiting. The next day, she went about unpacking, trying to make the house feel more like home. As the day passed, she explored its many rooms, some of which hadn't been touched in years. In the attic, she found boxes full of her grandmother's belongings, photographs, letters, and a locked wooden chest that piqued her curiosity. She tried to open it, but the lock was rusted shut. With a sigh, she left it for later. That night, as she lay in bed, she heard the knock again. 3 soft raps. Sarah bolted upright, her pulse pounding in her ears. She waited, hoping it wouldn't happen again, but then it did. Knock, knock, knock! This time, the door creaked open an inch, and Sarah's blood ran cold. Summoning her courage, she grabbed her phone and turned on the flashlight, shining it toward the door. It swung open slowly, revealing nothing but the dark, empty hallway. Trembling, she stepped out of bed and crept toward the door. The air was frigid, and the hallway seemed darker than it should have been, as though the shadows were deeper, thicker. "Hello?" she whispered, her voice shaking. Again, there was no reply. She checked each room upstairs, but everything was as it should be. Finally, she convinced herself it was just her imagination playing tricks on her. She locked her bedroom door, crawled back under the blankets, and spent the rest of the night with the lamp on. The next morning, Sarah decided to investigate. Her grandmother had always kept a journal, and Sarah found it in a drawer by the old writing desk in the study. Flipping through its pages, she found entries that grew more and more erratic as they went on. Her grandmother had written about shadows that moved on their own, voices whispering her name from the walls, and the constant feeling of being watched. One entry in particular made Sarah's stomach twist. January 17th, 1993, the knocking is getting louder. It comes every night now. I know it's not the wind or the old house, it's them. They're getting closer, and I don't know how much longer I can keep them out. I fear that if I open the door, I won't be the one to shut it again. Sarah closed the journal, her hands trembling. She decided to get out of the house for a while, hoping fresh air and sunlight would clear her mind. She wandered into the woods, feeling strangely watched even there. The forest was dense and unnaturally quiet, the kind of silence that felt wrong, as though every living thing had hidden from something. As she explored, she found something she'd never seen before, an old stone well, overgrown with moss and vines. The stones were blackened, and as she approached, she felt an intense sense of dread. She peered over the edge, but it was too dark to see the bottom. Suddenly, she heard it, a whisper, soft and mournful, drifting up from the darkness below. "Sarah," she stumbled back, heart hammering. She ran all the way back to the house, slamming the door behind her. Her mind raced with questions, but fear kept her from venturing near the woods again. That night, Sarah bolted the bedroom door and piled furniture in front of it. She sat in bed, clutching her grandmother's rosary, and tried to stay awake. Midnight came and went. 1 a.m. 2 a.m. Finally, at 3:12, she heard the knock. Knock, knock, knock. The door handle jiggled, and the wood groaned as though something heavy were leaning against it. Sarah clutched the rosary tighter, whispering prayers her grandmother had taught her. But the knocking grew louder, more forceful. The floorboards outside her room creaked, and the whispers began, soft at first, but growing louder. "Sarah, let us in! Let us in!" The room grew unbearably cold. Her breath came out in white puffs, and frost formed on the window pane. She could see her reflection, wide-eyed and pale, but behind her a shadow began to take shape. It was tall, impossibly thin, with long, bony fingers that reached toward her. Sarah spun around, but there was nothing there. The whispers grew frantic, overlapping voices, begging, pleading, some laughing cruelly. The knocking became pounding, and Sarah knew that whatever was on the other side of the door wouldn't be kept out much longer. Desperate, she grabbed the journal and flipped to the last page, hoping for a clue, an answer. The final entry read, "The well. They come from the well. To end it, I must return what was taken, but I'm too afraid. If you find this, please be braver than I was." Sarah's mind raced. Return what was taken? She remembered the locked chest in the attic. Without thinking, she bolted from the room, ignoring the way the shadows seemed to reach for her, and dashed up the stairs to the attic. The pounding followed her, echoing through the house. She found the chest and, with newfound strength born of terror, smashed the rusted lock with an old hammer. The lid creaked open, revealing a small, weathered doll, its porcelain face cracked and eyes eerily lifelike. The doll's dress was scorched and covered in dirt, and as Sarah lifted it, a wave of cold dread washed over her. The whispers surged, furious and desperate. "Return what was taken," they demanded. Clutching the doll, Sarah ran out of the house into the woods. The trees seemed to close in around her, branches clawing at her hair and clothes. She reached the well, gasping for breath, and without hesitation she hurled the doll into the darkness. The whispers stopped. The wind died, and for a moment the forest was still. Then a low, mournful sigh echoed from the well, and the oppressive presence lifted. Sarah stumbled backward, Radhika, watching as the shadows in the forest seemed to dissolve. When she returned to the house, it felt different, lighter, as though a curse had been broken. But she knew she would never spend another night there. Sarah packed her things and left, never looking back, though sometimes in the dead of night she still dreamed of that knock. And in those dreams she feared that one day something would come knocking again. The town of Ashford had a strange, unspoken rule. Nobody visited the cemetery after dark. The iron gates that guarded the place were always locked at sunset, and stories swirled among the locals about the spirits that stirred as soon as the sun dipped below the horizon. No one knew how the legend started, but most believed in it enough to steer clear. Except for Tom. Tom was a journalist who had recently moved to Ashford. He thrived on exposing urban legends and old wives' tales for what they were, just stories. When he heard the rumors about the haunted cemetery, he was intrigued and determined to investigate. He didn't believe in ghosts or curses. He only believed in facts. On a misty autumn night, Tom packed his camera, flashlight, and audio recorder. He wasn't planning to break into the cemetery exactly, just sneak over the low part of the fence and look around. "I'll write a piece that debunks this silly ghost story once and for all," he muttered as he parked his car just outside the cemetery gates. The iron bars loomed tall and skeletal in the fading twilight, ivy twisting through the gaps like veins. Tom didn't hesitate. He found a spot where the fence dipped and climbed over with ease. As his feet hit the soft, cold earth, he felt a momentary shiver run down his spine. He brushed it off as the chilly air and flipped on his flashlight. The cemetery was shrouded in mist, gravestones jutting out of the ground like broken teeth. The silence was profound, almost too heavy. Tom felt a sense of unease, but he pushed forward. He aimed his flashlight around, noting how the light barely cut through the thick fog. He started his audio recorder. October 12th, 11:03 p.m. Standing in Ashford Cemetery. Temperature is unusually cold, but the atmosphere is exactly what you'd expect from an old graveyard. No sign of anything supernatural. He paused, listening. The town claims spirits roam freely after dark. Let's see if there's any truth to that. As he wandered deeper, he found old mausoleums, their iron doors rusted shut. One in particular caught his attention. The engraving above the door read, "The Blackwell Family," and the name sparked a memory. The Blackwell family was notorious in Ashford lore. They'd been one of the town's wealthiest families, but their fortune was said to be cursed. The whole family had perished mysteriously over a single year, and some claimed they were still restless in the afterlife. Tom approached the mausoleum, shining his light on the ornate carvings. Here lies the Blackwell family, one of Ashford's most infamous. People say that if you knock on their door, they'll knock back. He chuckled to himself. Let's put that to the test. He lifted his hand and knocked 3 times on the rusted iron door. The sound echoed, hollow and sharp, into the misty darkness. He stood there, waiting, the cold seeping into his bones. Nothing happened. He shook his head, amused. See? Just... Then he heard it. Knock, knock, knock. The blood drained from Tom's face. He whipped around, shining his flashlight in every direction, but there was no one there. The fog seemed thicker now, pressing closer, and the temperature had dropped even more. He tried to laugh it off. Probably just the echo, he muttered, but his voice sounded thin and strained. He turned back to the mausoleum, unease gnawing at him. As he took a step back, he heard another sound. This time, a whisper. "Leave," it breathed, barely more than a sigh. Tom froze, straining to listen. The whisper came again, softer but angrier. "Leave. Now." Fear coiled in his gut, but he forced himself to continue. "Probably the wind," he said, though he didn't quite believe it. He aimed his flashlight at the ground, but then he noticed something that made his heart race. Footprints, fresh and deep, leading away from the mausoleum into the fog. They weren't his. He backed away slowly, his every instinct screaming at him to leave, but he couldn't help following the prints with his flashlight. They led to an old willow tree at the edge of the cemetery, its drooping branches rustling softly in the breeze. But it wasn't the tree that terrified him. It was the figure standing beneath it. A woman in a tattered white dress stood there, her back to him, her long hair draping down her shoulders. Her head was tilted at an odd angle, and her hands hung limply at her sides. The air around her shimmered as though she were wrapped in mist. Tom's flashlight beam faltered, but he refused to blink. His breath came in short, panicked gasps. "Hello," he called out, his voice cracking. The woman didn't move. The fog seemed to coil around her, almost protective, and Tom realized with growing horror that he could see through her. She was translucent, a ghostly outline against the mist. Slowly she began to turn. Her movements were jerky, unnatural, like a marionette on strings. When her face came into view, Tom's stomach dropped. Her eyes were empty, black pits, and her mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. "Leave," she whispered, her voice echoing around him. Tom stumbled back, tripping over a gravestone and crashing to the ground. His flashlight rolled away, leaving him in near darkness. He scrambled to his feet, grabbing his flashlight and running, adrenaline surging through his veins. The cemetery seemed endless, the gravestones like obstacles rising to trip him. The whispers followed him, a chorus of voices pleading and demanding. Some begged for help, others warned him of impending doom. As he neared the fence, he heard one final voice, louder and clearer than the rest. It sounded like a child, its tone sorrowful and cold. "Why didn't you listen?" Tom vaulted over the fence, landing hard on the other side. He didn't stop running until he was in his car, hands shaking as he fumbled with the keys. The engine roared to life, and he sped away, not daring to look back at the cemetery gates. The next day, Tom tried to write about what he'd experienced, but the words wouldn't come. He couldn't shake the image of the ghostly woman and the echo of that child's voice. He reviewed the audio recording, hoping to convince himself it was all in his head. The recording started normally, his narration, the knock on the mausoleum door, and then knock, knock, knock. Tom's breath caught in his throat. The recording continued, and then he heard the whisper, "Leave now." But what followed made his blood run cold. Beneath the whisper, there was laughter. A soft, childish giggle that seemed to echo from beyond the grave. Tom deleted the recording, his hands trembling, but he couldn't erase the memory. He moved out of Ashford soon after, leaving the story unfinished. But the locals say that on foggy nights, if you listen closely at the cemetery gates, you can still hear the knock on the Blackwell mausoleum. And sometimes, if you're really unlucky, the spirits will knock back. The old Lacey mansion had been abandoned for decades. Perched on a lonely hill and swallowed by overgrown weeds and ivy, it cast a shadow that stretched like clawed fingers over the small town below. People whispered that the house was cursed, that strange things happened to those who dared to venture inside. But to 15-year-old Aaron and his friends, the mansion was the perfect setting for a night of thrilling dares. It was a stormy Friday night when Aaron, his best friend Jake, and Jake's sister Emily decided to explore the mansion. Armed with flashlights and a cheap camcorder, they set off for the house. The wind howled through the trees, and rain splattered against their jackets, but the thrill of the adventure made them press on. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" Emily asked as they approached the front gate, which hung crookedly from its rusted hinges. Her voice wavered slightly, but she tried to hide her nervousness. Jake scoffed. "Come on, Emily. It's just an old house. What's the worst that could happen?" Aaron forced a grin, though he, too, felt the prickling sensation of unease crawling up his spine. "Yeah, it's probably just rats and creaky floorboards." They pushed through the gate, the metal groaning in protest, and made their way up the weed-choked path to the front door. The windows, shattered and grimy, gaped like empty eye sockets, and the door itself was covered in deep scratches as if something had tried to claw its way out. Jake pushed the door open, and it swung inward with a loud creak, revealing the dark interior. The smell of damp rot and decay hit them, making Emily wrinkle her nose. Aaron switched on his flashlight, the beam cutting through the thick darkness and illuminating the dusty foyer. Broken furniture lay scattered across the floor, and the wallpaper had peeled away in long, curling strips. "All right, let's make this quick," Aaron said, trying to keep his voice steady. They stepped inside, their footsteps muffled by layers of dust and debris. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating, and the house seemed to groan and shift around them as though it were alive. They split up to explore different parts of the house, each of them taking a section. Aaron wandered into what used to be the living room. A grand piano sat in the corner, its keys broken and yellowed with age. As he examined the room, his flashlight flickered and he cursed under his breath, tapping it until the light stabilized. Meanwhile, Emily found herself in the kitchen. The cupboards hung open, their contents spilled across the floor, and the sink was full of brown, stagnant water. She felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm outside and decided to rejoin the others. As she turned to leave, she froze. A whisper, faint and chilling, drifted through the kitchen. "Emily?" Her heart thudded painfully in her chest. She spun around, shining her flashlight into every corner. "Jake? Aaron?" she called, but the whisper came again, more insistent this time. "Emily, help me." Panicking, Emily backed out of the kitchen and collided with Jake, who was coming down the hall. She screamed, and Jake stumbled back, dropping the camcorder. "Whoa, it's just me," he said, his face pale but attempting a nervous smile. "What happened?" Emily's eyes were wide with fear. Someone whispered my name," she stammered. "It was coming from the kitchen." Jake's expression faltered, but he tried to stay brave. "Probably just the wind," he said, though he didn't sound convinced. "Let's find Aaron and get out of here." They found Aaron in the living room, staring at the grand piano. His flashlight beam was fixed on something that made his face pale and his hands shake. "Guys," he whispered, "look at this." On the piano keys lay a set of bloody fingerprints, smudged and smeared, as if someone had desperately tried to play a tune. Emily grabbed Jake's arm, her pulse racing. "We need to leave. Now." Just as they turned to leave, the piano let out a sudden, jarring note. All three of them jumped, and Aaron nearly dropped his flashlight. The note echoed through the house, followed by a soft, rhythmic tapping that seemed to come from upstairs. It was the sound of footsteps, uneven and shuffling. "Is someone else here?" Jake whispered, but Aaron shook his head, his throat dry. The footsteps grew louder, making their way down the grand staircase. Slowly, with dread pooling in their stomachs, they turned to look. A figure emerged from the darkness at the top of the stairs. It was a woman, or at least something that resembled one. Her hair was matted, her skin pale and sallow, with deep, hollow eye sockets that wept black tears. Her mouth stretched into a twisted smile, revealing teeth that were jagged and broken. Her arms moved in jerky, unnatural motions, as if she were a puppet on strings. "Why did you come?" she whispered, her voice like the rustling of dry leaves. She began to descend the stairs, her footsteps echoing in the silence. The three friends were paralyzed with fear, unable to look away from the specter approaching them. Aaron snapped out of his trance first. "Run!" he shouted, grabbing Emily's hand and dragging her toward the front door. Jake scrambled after them, but the door slammed shut before they could reach it, the doorknob rattling as if held by an invisible hand. "Please, we're sorry," Emily cried, pounding on the door. The woman on the stairs stopped halfway down, tilting her head in an unnatural, bone-cracking motion. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered again, and then the house seemed to come alive. The walls creaked and groaned, and the temperature plummeted. The shadows around them twisted and writhed, reaching out like living things. Aaron turned, trying to find another way out, but the house was changing. Hallways stretched into darkness, doors appeared where they hadn't been before, and the windows vanished, leaving them trapped. The woman on the stairs started to laugh, a sound that sent shivers down their spines. Jake fumbled with the camcorder, desperate to capture some proof of the horror unfolding before them. But when he looked through the viewfinder, his heart stopped. The camera didn't show Aaron and Emily standing beside him. Instead, it showed them lying on the floor, pale and lifeless, with eyes wide in terror. Jake dropped the camcorder, and it shattered on the floor. The woman was closer now, her broken smile widening as she reached out a clawed hand. "Stay with me," she crooned. "Forever." The house seemed to close in around them, the walls bending and warping, and the friends screamed, their voices swallowed by the darkness. No one heard them, and when the storm finally passed, the mansion stood as silent as ever, its secrets buried deep within. The next morning, the townspeople found Aaron's abandoned car by the side of the road. The mansion's front gate was open, creaking in the breeze, but there was no sign of the teenagers. Some claimed they could still hear their screams echoing through the mansion on stormy nights, a warning to anyone foolish enough to enter. And so the legend of the Lacey mansion grew, more terrifying than ever, but no one was brave or foolish enough to test it again. Jason was always the skeptic of his friend group, the one who rolled his eyes at ghost stories and dismissed paranormal tales as figments of overactive imaginations. So when his friends dared him to spend one night alone in the abandoned St. Mary's Hospital, he scoffed. The old building, a decaying ruin in the outskirts of town, was rumored to be haunted, but Jason was determined to prove everyone wrong. The hospital had been shut down for over 50 years after a series of mysterious patient disappearances and unexplained deaths. It stood in darkness, vines creeping up its crumbling facade and shattered windows like blind, gaping eyes. But none of that fazed Jason. Armed with his flashlight, a sleeping bag, and his phone to record everything, he stepped inside just before midnight. The entrance hall smelled of mildew and stale air, and debris littered the floors. A broken wheelchair lay on its side, one wheel still spinning slowly in the faint breeze. The graffiti that covered the walls did little to distract from the ominous feeling that hung over the place, like an invisible shroud. "See, just an empty, creepy building," Jason muttered, his voice echoing uncomfortably in the vast, abandoned space. He set up his sleeping bag in what used to be the main lobby, under the shadow of the grand staircase that led to the patient rooms above. The broken remnants of the old reception desk loomed behind him, and he did his best to ignore the way the darkness seemed to press in from every corner. He began filming with his phone, making a mock ghost hunter introduction. "Here we are in the famous St. Mary's Hospital, where, according to legend, the spirits of the lost still wander the halls. But let's be real, there's nothing here but dust and rats." He laughed, trying to shake off the growing sense of unease. Just as he finished speaking, he heard something, a faint shuffling sound like footsteps on the floor above. He froze, his flashlight beam quivering as he directed it at the ceiling. "Probably just an animal," he said, but his voice had lost its bravado. He waited, but the sound didn't repeat. Breathing a little easier, he turned back to his phone. "See? Just old buildings making old building noises." He was about to settle into his sleeping bag when his flashlight flickered. The light wavered and then went out, plunging him into darkness. Cursing, Jason smacked the flashlight, and after a moment of fiddling, it came back on. That's when he noticed it. Standing at the bottom of the staircase, barely illuminated by his shaky beam, was a figure. It was a man, or at least, it had the shape of one. The figure wore a white hospital gown that fluttered slightly as if caught in a breeze, but what made Jason's blood run cold was the figure's face, or lack thereof. The head was featureless, a smooth blank expanse of skin with no eyes, no mouth, no nose. Jason stumbled backward, his heart pounding, and in that instant, the figure vanished. One blink, and it was gone. He gasped, clutching his flashlight, his hands slick with sweat. "What the?" Shaking, he tried to rationalize. "A trick of the light," he whispered. "It has to be." But he didn't believe it. The image of the faceless figure was burned into his mind. He was about to run for the exit when something else caught his attention. The wheelchair that had been lying on its side was now upright, standing in the middle of the room. He had heard nothing, seen nothing move, but there it was. Jason's throat tightened and he slowly edged toward the door. "Okay, guys, prank's over," he called, his voice cracking. Very funny. But his friends weren't there. No one was. He turned and bolted for the exit, but the door slammed shut before he reached it, the sound reverberating through the empty hospital. Panicked, Jason yanked at the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. The shuffling footsteps returned, louder now, coming from the corridor behind him. He spun around, pressing his back against the door, flashlight beam searching wildly for the source of the sound. The hallway stretched on, lined with rooms where patients had once been treated. The doors were mostly closed, but one, just a few feet down, was slightly ajar. Jason's breath came in rapid, shallow gasps as the footsteps grew closer, stopping right outside that cracked door. He could see nothing but darkness beyond it, but then, slowly, the door began to open wider. A cold, sickening dread settled in his gut as he watched. Something stepped out, and his flashlight flickered again, as if struggling to reveal the nightmare in front of him. The figure that emerged was not quite human. It was wrapped in blood-stained bandages, its arms bound to its sides, yet it moved forward, jerking and twitching as though pulled by invisible strings. Its head tilted at an unnatural angle, and though its eyes were covered, Jason could feel it staring straight at him. Jason's body refused to move, paralyzed with fear. The thing shuffled closer, the sound of the bandages dragging along the ground like dry leaves. Its head twitched again, and Jason's flashlight died completely, leaving him in utter darkness. A sudden, raspy whisper filled the silence. "They never left. Neither will you." Jason screamed, fumbling with his phone, trying desperately to use its light, but the screen wouldn't turn on. The whisper came again, this time right next to his ear. "Stay with us." Something cold and clammy brushed against his arm, and Jason broke free from his paralysis, stumbling backward into the door. His shoulders slammed into it, and it flew open, spilling him out into the rain. He didn't stop to catch his breath, didn't even look back. He just ran. Ran until he was outside the hospital grounds and into the safety of the streetlights. His friends found him hours later, shivering and pale, muttering about faceless figures and bandaged phantoms. They laughed at first, thinking he was joking, but his haunted eyes and trembling hands told them otherwise. Jason never spoke of what he'd seen in St. Mary's Hospital again, but his friends noticed he was never the same. The old hospital remained, silent and waiting, and the legend only grew. Those brave enough to approach on stormy nights claim to hear whispers carried on the wind, and some even swear they've seen figures standing at the broken windows, watching, waiting for the next soul foolish enough to step inside. The small town of Woodridge had a stretch of road that everyone knew to avoid after dark, Black Hollow Lane. It was a winding path lined with gnarled trees whose branches arched overhead, forming a natural tunnel that swallowed any trace of moonlight. Travelers told stories of strange sights along the road, a shadowy figure that would appear in your rearview mirror, disembodied whispers calling your name, or headlights that chased you, only to vanish when you pulled over to see who was behind you. But Claire had always prided herself on being logical. She wasn't afraid of a haunted road, and she certainly didn't believe in ghost stories. So, when she found herself driving home late one night from a friend's house and her GPS guided her down Black Hollow Lane, she rolled her eyes. "It's just a road," she told herself as she turned onto it. The moment she drove under the canopy of twisted branches, her car's headlights seemed to dim. The darkness was thick, suffocating, and the road ahead disappeared into a yawning void. Claire tightened her grip on the steering wheel, trying to ignore the chill that settled over her. She flicked on the high beams, but they barely penetrated the shadows. As she drove, the quiet was almost oppressive. Her radio had gone static the moment she entered the lane, and her phone had no signal. The only sounds were the hum of her engine and the crunch of gravel beneath her tires. She kept her eyes on the road, trying not to think about the stories she'd heard. But then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw movement. Claire glanced at her side mirror and felt her blood run cold. A shadow flitted along the side of her car, keeping pace with her. It was too fast to be a person, and when she turned her head to look directly, there was nothing there. She laughed nervously, though the sound came out strained. "Get a grip, Claire," she whispered. But the shadows only deepened. The trees seemed to twist and sway, as if whispering secrets to each other. Her headlights caught glimpses of strange shapes, faces in the bark, eyes in the dark, things she told herself were just tricks of the light. Suddenly, her car's engine sputtered. Claire's heart raced as she pressed her foot harder on the gas, but the engine choked and died. The car coasted to a stop, and she was left in near total darkness. Her hands shook as she tried to restart the car, but it only groaned in protest. "No, no, no," she muttered, her voice quivering. The silence closed in around her, and then she heard it. A faint tapping coming from somewhere outside the car. She froze, barely breathing, and listened. The tapping grew louder, as if fingers or something sharper were drumming against the roof. Claire's pulse thundered in her ears. "It's just tree branches," she whispered, trying to calm herself. "Just branches." But then, from the darkness, came a soft, sing-song voice. Claire. Her heart stopped. She hadn't told anyone she was taking this road, and she was sure she'd been alone. The voice called her name again, drawing it out in a playful, mocking tone. "Claire." Something moved in the trees ahead, and she caught a glimpse of a figure standing on the side of the road. It was shrouded in shadow, tall and thin, with limbs that seemed too long, too angular. The figure tilted its head, and the voice came again. "Why don't you step outside?" Claire's hands were clammy as she fumbled with the door locks, making sure they were all secure. She grabbed her phone, but it was useless. No signal, no hope of calling for help. The tapping on the roof stopped abruptly, replaced by silence so heavy it was suffocating. Then came a slow, scraping sound, like nails dragging across the car's metal roof. Claire squeezed her eyes shut, wishing she could disappear. The scraping stopped, and for a moment she dared to open her eyes. The figure was gone. She sighed shakily, but the relief was short-lived. Her rearview mirror caught a movement, and she turned to look over her shoulder. Her blood ran cold. A face was pressed against the back window, pale and grinning, with eyes that gleamed like polished onyx. The mouth stretched too wide, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth. The face didn't belong to a person. It was something wrong, something out of a nightmare. The grin widened. "Come play, Claire," it whispered, fogging up the glass with its breath. Claire screamed, her body jolting with terror. She slammed her fists against the steering wheel, desperate to start the car. The headlights flickered, and miraculously the engine roared to life. Without thinking, she threw the car into gear and sped forward, tires kicking up gravel. She didn't dare look back, even as the laughter echoed in her ears. The road twisted and turned, and Claire fought to keep the car steady. She kept expecting to see the figure ahead of her, blocking her path, but it never appeared. Finally, she burst out of the tunnel of trees and into the open, where the moonlight bathed the road. The oppressive feeling lifted, and the air seemed lighter. Shaking, Claire didn't stop until she was safely back in town, where streetlights illuminated every corner. She pulled over, her hands still trembling as she tried to catch her breath. Her phone buzzed, and she realized she had signal again. She almost sobbed with relief, quickly calling her best friend. When the police arrived to check out Black Hollow Lane, they found nothing unusual. No signs of anyone or anything that could have caused what Claire experienced. But the scratches on her car roof remained long, deep grooves that couldn't be explained. Claire never took that road again, but sometimes, on nights when the wind rustled through the trees, she swore she could still hear the voice. Claire, it would whisper, as if waiting for her to return, as if it would never forget. In the outskirts of a sleepy little town stood a weathered house known as the Old Harper Place. It had been abandoned for years, and most people avoided it, muttering about curses and terrible things that had happened within its walls. But for 16-year-old Lucy and her friends, the house was the perfect place to test their bravery. It was the middle of autumn, the air crisp and the wind carrying the scent of falling leaves. Lucy, along with her best friends Sam, Eric, and Chloe, dared each other to spend the evening exploring the Old Harper Place. Armed with flashlights and a spirit of adventure, they made their way to the house just as the sun began to dip below the horizon. The front porch sagged under their weight, and the wooden boards creaked and groaned as they stepped inside. Dust motes hung in the air, illuminated by beams of dying sunlight that filtered through the broken windows. The smell of decay and mildew was overwhelming, and the entire house felt heavy, as if the past still lingered in every corner. "Okay, so what's the plan?" Sam asked, trying to sound braver than he felt. Lucy grinned. "We split up, check out different rooms, and meet back here in half an hour." "Easy." Eric rolled his eyes. "Classic horror movie mistake," he muttered. "Fine, but let's not get too carried away." They each picked a different direction, their footsteps echoing in the empty halls. Lucy headed toward the kitchen, her flashlight casting long shadows on the peeling wallpaper. The kitchen was a ruin, with broken dishes still scattered on the floor and rusted utensils hanging from hooks. She wandered over to the sink, where dark stains marred the porcelain. Her flash wavered, and she frowned. The darkness seemed alive, shifting just at the edges of her vision. Then she heard it, a faint, raspy whisper. Lucy. She whipped around, shining her flashlight in every direction, but the room was empty. Her heart pounded in her chest. Okay, get a grip, she whispered to herself. But the whisper came again, clearer this time. Lucy, come closer. Her breath caught in her throat, and she stumbled backward, tripping over a broken chair. The flashlight slipped from her hands and hit the floor, the beam spinning wildly. She scrambled to grab it, but when she turned it toward the doorway, she saw a shadow standing there. It was the shape of a person, tall and thin, but it lacked any features, a dark outline that seemed to absorb all light. Lucy was frozen with fear as the shadow slowly raised an arm and pointed at her. Leave, it hissed. Meanwhile, Eric was upstairs, poking through what remained of a bedroom. A moth-eaten mattress lay on the floor, and the wallpaper was covered in strange, dark symbols he couldn't understand. He was about to take a picture when he heard a creaking noise behind him, like someone stepping across the wooden floorboards. He turned, expecting to see one of his friends, but the room was empty. He frowned. Chloe? Sam? He called, but there was no answer. Another creak. This time it was coming from the closet. Eric's flashlight flickered as he approached it, every nerve in his body telling him to leave, but curiosity pushed him forward. He reached for the handle, his hand trembling, and yanked the door open. Nothing. Just old coats hanging limply on rusted hangers. He sighed, relief flooding through him, but then, in the darkness behind the coats, he saw something move. A hand, pale and skeletal, reached out and grabbed his wrist. Eric screamed and stumbled backward, pulling free of the icy grip. The closet door slammed shut and he ran from the room, his heart racing. He nearly collided with Chloe, who had come running from the other end of the hallway. Did you hear that? She whispered, her face pale. I thought I saw something in the mirror in the bathroom. It moved, Eric. It smiled at me. Downstairs, Sam was having his own nightmare. He had wandered into what used to be a study, where old books lined the shelves and an ancient moth-eaten rug covered the floor. As he examined the books, he noticed that one of them was lying open on the desk, even though the rest were neatly placed on the shelves. The book's pages were yellowed and cracked, shut, and the text was written in an unfamiliar language. But what caught Sam's attention was a drawing in the margins. A detailed sketch of the house itself, with dark figures drawn in the windows. He shivered, but before he could close the book, the pages began to turn on their own, faster and faster, as if an invisible hand was flipping through them. Sam stumbled backward, knocking over a chair. The book slammed shut, and the room went ice cold. His breath formed clouds in the air, and he heard a voice, a deep, guttural growl. Get out, or you'll never leave. He didn't need to be told twice. He bolted out of the study and ran straight into Lucy, who was fleeing the kitchen with tears streaming down her face. We have to get out of here, she yelled, grabbing his arm. The four friends finally met in the front hall, their faces pale and eyes wide with fear. What did you guys see? Chloe asked, her voice shaking. Doesn't matter, Eric said, glancing over his shoulder at the dark hallway. We need to leave. Now. They didn't waste another second. They sprinted for the front door, but as they reached it, it slammed shut in their faces. The whole house seemed to groan, and a cold wind rushed through the hall, carrying whispers that swirled around them. Stay, stay. Lucy gripped the doorknob, her hands slick with sweat, and pulled with all her strength. It wouldn't budge. Suddenly, the whispers stopped, replaced by a low, guttural laughter. Shadows began to slither out from every corner of the room, pooling together and forming shapes that moved, that reached for them. Chloe screamed, and the noise seemed to snap something in the house. The door flew open, and the four friends tumbled out onto the porch. The laughter echoed behind them, growing fainter as they stumbled down the steps and ran, never looking back. When they finally reached the safety of the street, they collapsed onto the pavement, gasping for air. The old Harper place loomed behind them, silent and unyielding, its windows like empty eyes that watched them leave. The house had let them go. But as they caught their breath and tried to process what had happened, one thing was certain. They would never return to the old Harper place, and they would never forget the terror they had faced. Some houses, they realized, are more than just haunted. Some houses are alive and they do not like intruders. It was a moonless night when James found himself lost on the back roads of a remote countryside. His GPS had failed him, the signal disappearing into nothingness, and he'd been driving for what felt like hours, the dense forest pressing in from both sides of the road. His car's headlights barely pierced the inky blackness, and he could only see a few feet ahead. Frustration gnawed at him, but more than that, a growing sense of unease started to creep up his spine. He had passed no other cars, no houses, just mile after mile of dark, unending trees. The road seemed to twist and bend in unnatural ways, as though the forest itself was trying to lead him deeper into its heart. Just when James began to wonder if he should turn back, he spotted something up ahead. It was a small, run-down gas station, lit only by a single flickering neon sign that buzzed in the still air. Relieved to find some sign of life, James pulled in, parking near one of the ancient gas pumps. The building looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1950s, with peeling paint and windows so dirty they were nearly opaque. Yet, the open sign in the window glowed defiantly. James stepped out of his car, shivering as a chill wind rustled through the trees. He pushed open the door to the gas station, and a bell above it jingled, announcing his arrival. The interior was dimly lit, the fluorescent bulbs casting a sickly yellow glow over the shelves, which were sparsely stocked with dusty snack foods and rusted cans. Behind the counter stood an old man, his face heavily lined and shadowed under a frayed cap. He looked up as James entered, his eyes dull but unsettlingly intense. "Evenin'," the man drawled, his voice gravelly. "Lost, are ya?" James forced a smile, though his skin prickled. "Yeah, actually. My GPS isn't working, and I could use some directions." The old man nodded slowly, as if he'd heard this story 1,000 times. "Not many folks come through here," he said. "You're deep in the woods now, easy to lose your way." He pointed a gnarled finger toward the road outside. "Once you leave, stay straight. Don't turn, no matter what you see or hear." James raised an eyebrow. "What I see or hear?" he asked, chuckling nervously. "What's that supposed to mean?" The old man didn't answer. Instead, he slid a dusty map across the counter. "Take this," he said. "It's old, but it'll get you out of here." James picked up the map, trying to suppress a growing sense of unease. "Thanks," he muttered, and started to leave. But the old man's voice stopped him. "Be careful," he warned. "This road plays tricks. Not everything you see is real." James turned back to ask what he meant, but the man had already disappeared into a back room, the door swinging shut behind him. Shaking his head, James left the station and returned to his car. The warning lingered in his mind, but he tried to brush it off as small-town weirdness. He had to get out of here. Back on the road, James kept the map open on the passenger seat, glancing at it every few minutes. The woods seemed even darker now, and the shadows between the trees seemed to shift as he drove. The car's radio, which had only produced static earlier, suddenly came to life, hissing and crackling. Faintly, he could hear voices, almost like whispers. He turned it off, but the static continued, softer, as if coming from somewhere deeper in the car. James gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles whitening. The old man's warning echoed in his mind. "Don't turn, no matter what you see or hear." He had driven only a few miles when he noticed something strange. Ahead of him, on the side of the road, a woman was standing. She wore a simple white dress, her long hair hanging over her face. She didn't move, didn't even seem to acknowledge his approaching headlights. As James drew closer, he could see her dress was tattered, stained with something dark. He slowed the car, unease coiling in his gut. Her presence felt wrong. Against his better judgment, he rolled down the window slightly. "Ma'am?" he called out. "Are you all right? Do you need help?" The woman didn't respond. Instead, she lifted her head, and James's breath caught in his throat. Her eyes were pure black, like twin voids, and her mouth twisted into a grin too wide, stretching unnaturally across her face. James slammed his foot on the gas pedal, speeding past her. His heart raced, but when he looked in his rearview mirror, she was gone. He blinked, shaken, and tried to calm himself. "Just your imagination," he whispered. "It's late. You're tired." But the road wasn't done with him. A few minutes later, James saw headlights behind him approaching fast. Relief flooded through him. Another car, another person, maybe someone who could help. But as the vehicle drew nearer, something felt off. The headlights were impossibly bright, almost blinding, and they seemed to hover slightly above the road. The car pulled up right behind him, its lights filling his rearview mirror. James squinted, trying to see the driver, but he couldn't make out anything past the glare. The other car began to swerve dangerously close, and James's hands shook as he tried to keep control of his own vehicle. "Get away from me!" He shouted, but his voice was lost in the roar of the wind and the pounding of his heart. Suddenly, the headlights disappeared. James glanced back, stunned. The car was gone. He pressed the brakes, his tires skidding slightly, and looked around. The road was empty. No sign of the car, no taillights, nothing. James's hands were clammy and he could barely breathe. He forced himself to keep driving, remembering the old man's words. Stay straight, don't turn. He clenched his jaw, determined to get out of these woods. But then, in the middle of the road, he saw something that nearly made him swerve. There, illuminated by his headlights, was the gas station he had just left. It was exactly the same. The flickering neon sign, the peeling paint. James slammed on the brakes, bringing his car to a stop. How is that possible? He whispered. He'd driven in a straight line. He hadn't turned, hadn't made any wrong moves. Yet here he was, back where he'd started. The gas station door creaked open, and the old man stepped out, his eyes dark and knowing. He raised a hand in a slow wave, as if he had been expecting James all along. Panicking, James threw the car into reverse, but the road behind him was gone, swallowed by the forest. The trees had closed in, trapping him. The whispers returned, louder now, echoing through the car. James, come join us. You can't leave. Terrified, James looked back at the old man, but he was no longer alone. Shadows surrounded him, shapes of people with empty eyes and twisted grins, their faces pale and hungry. They stepped closer, reaching for James. The last thing he saw was the old man's mouth twisting into a smile. Welcome to the road, he said, his voice carrying over the whispers. You'll be staying a while. And then the darkness claimed James. The car's headlights flickered out and the forest returned to silence, waiting patiently for the next traveler to lose their way. The storm had been raging for hours, and Emily was grateful to finally pull into the driveway of her childhood home. Her parents had moved out years ago, but the house remained a family retreat, tucked away deep in the woods. The trees surrounding it were like silent guardians, their branches swaying and groaning in the howling wind. Emily hadn't visited in ages, but she needed a quiet place to escape the stress of city life, if only for a weekend. The house was just as she remembered, old but full of memories. She parked the car, grabbed her bags, and dashed through the downpour, fumbling with the house keys. Once inside, she shivered, droplets of rain pooling around her shoes. The house smelled faintly of cedar and dust, the scent of years gone by. She flipped on the lights, but the storm must have knocked out the power. The house remained shrouded in gloom. Great, Emily muttered, pulling out her phone to use as a flashlight. She made her way to the kitchen, finding the emergency candles in a drawer. The flames flickered in the dark, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The house felt colder than it should have. The kind of cold that seeped into your bones, the kind that didn't quite feel natural. Emily tried to shake off the feeling. Just nerves, she whispered to herself, lighting another candle. The storm outside roared, rattling the windows. She decided to set up her things in the living room, where an old fireplace still stood. Maybe she'd get a fire going and shake off the chill. She knelt down to inspect the fireplace, checking the logs that had been left behind. As she worked, she thought she heard something, a faint creak from upstairs. Emily paused, straining to hear over the wind and rain. Probably just the house settling, she told herself, but deep down she felt uneasy. After getting the fire lit, she sat down on the old couch, the warmth starting to bring some comfort. But just as she began to relax, a noise echoed through the house, a soft, rhythmic tapping coming from above. Her heart skipped a beat. It almost sounded like footsteps. Slowly, cautiously, Emily stood up. Her candle flickered in her hand as she made her way to the staircase. "Hello?" she called out, her voice sounding too small in the cavernous dark house. No answer, just the tapping, which had now stopped. She swallowed hard, feeling foolish for even being nervous. It was probably an animal, she reasoned, a raccoon or a squirrel seeking shelter from the storm. But as she stood at the base of the stairs, she heard something that made her skin crawl, a whisper. It was faint, almost drowned out by the rain, but unmistakable. Emily. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. The whisper had come from the second floor. Emily's heart pounded. It had to be the storm playing tricks on her ears. Yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Clutching the candle tightly, she forced herself up the stairs, one creaking step at a time. The hallway upstairs stretched out before her, lined with old family photos. The shadows seemed to writhe and shift, and she could swear some of the faces in the pictures looked different. But that was impossible. She shook her head, trying to clear her mind. At the end of the hallway was her old bedroom, the door ajar. The whisper came again, low and drawn out. Emily? The candlelight quivered, and Emily stepped into her old room, her heart pounding. The room was just as she'd left it, with her childhood bed and shelves full of dusty books. She swept the room with her phone's light but saw nothing, only shadows and familiar, forgotten memories. Then, in the reflection of the mirror across the room, she saw movement. Emily spun around, but there was no one there. She looked back at the mirror, her hand trembling as she lifted the candle. Her reflection stared back at her, but then she realized it was wrong. Her reflection wasn't mimicking her movements. It was watching her, a slight eerie grin spreading across its face. Emily stumbled back, dropping the candle. It sputtered out, plunging the room into darkness. Her reflection in the mirror didn't disappear. Instead, it stepped closer to the glass, pressing its hands against the inside of the mirror as though trying to push through. "Don't leave me, Emily," it whispered, its voice echoing through the room. Emily bolted out of the bedroom, slamming the door behind her. She ran down the stairs, her foot slipping on the last step, sending her sprawling to the floor. Pain shot through her ankle, but she barely noticed. She scrambled to her feet, grabbing her car keys, her mind only screaming one thing: "Get out!" As she yanked open the front door, the wind from the storm nearly threw her backward. She was about to dash out into the rain when she felt a cold hand grip her shoulder. She turned, expecting to see her reflection, twisted and wrong, standing behind her, but there was nothing there. Panicking, she ran out into the storm, not caring about the rain or the cold. She reached her car, fumbling with the keys. The headlights flashed on as she started the engine, and in their glow, she saw the house. Every window was dark, except for her bedroom. The light from the mirror still shone, and for a split second, she thought she saw someone standing there, watching her, a figure that looked just like her. Emily didn't look back again. She sped away, the rain pounding on her windshield. Even as she drove further from the house, she couldn't shake the feeling that she hadn't escaped, that something had followed her. To this day, Emily avoids her childhood home. It sits abandoned as it always has, the mirror in her old bedroom covered with a heavy cloth. But sometimes, late at night, neighbors claim they hear whispers coming from the house, whispers calling out a name. And sometimes they say, you can still see a figure in the window, waiting for someone to come home.